So welcome everyone. I think we are going to start. We have to start on time so that I think we can also discuss have a better discussions among those who are attending. Okay, so this is a meta journal hour for those who have not joined us in the first one. So this is a meta journal hour. We call it meta journal hour because we are conducting an kind of journal club-like discussions, appraising important paper, and with emphasis on the methods being employed in that kind of in that research. And it's an hour. We hope this can be covered over an hour. Yeah. Okay, so I welcome everyone again to this second series. Second series because this is the second time. And we have a very important papers to look at. So this paper is one of the many papers reported from NutriNet Sante prospective cohort study. And for your information, this study has published in a few important and major journals. And this one was published in JAMA. I think they do have other reports in BMJ in other important journals. Okay, so let's see what we can learn from this. This study was actually reported by journalism, a journalist, as one of the largest and good dietary related scientific clinical research in the modern medicine. Yeah, so we shall see how good and whether we can do a better job if we were to repeat something similar of this kind of study in Malaysia or in some other country. Yeah, so we shall hear this Miss Nurul Iman Hafiza Adnan, a research officer from CRU HPPM, to kind of guide us and bring us along the study and how is reported in this journal. Okay, so pass to you, Iman.
Thank you, Prof. Chu, for the kind introduction. So again, my name is Nurul Iman. So today I will be guiding you throughout this session. So I will also encourage active participation in which that along our sessions, I would encourage that if you have any comments or any ideas or any input that you want to give, that you want to ask, you can actually ask along our session. So you don't really have to wait at the end of our sessions. Okay, so this is, sorry, let me, okay. So this is the article for today in which that we are going to discuss on this paper titled Ultra-Processed Food Consumption and the Risk of Type 2 Diabetes among participants of the NutriNet Sante prospective cohort. So as Prof. Chu has mentioned, that this study has been published in the JAMA Internal Medicine, which is one of the most good journals out there to publish papers. Okay, so before we start, I just want to introduce you to this, what we call as a critical appraisal skills program, in which that this is one of the most important skills or one of the most important component in writing a research paper, in which that we have to know how to appraise a research paper to ensure that the study is good, the study is credible, and also the study is useful for us to use in our daily practice, in our working practice. So you can actually Google on this website, the critical appraisal skills program, because I would also be using this checklist in order to appraise our research or our articles throughout our meta journal, our session. Okay, so these are some of the checklists that they have. So they have different checklists for different type of studies. So let's say today we are going to appraise the cohort study. So I'm going to use this checklist, which is for particularly for the cohort study checklist. Okay, so let's begin with the introduction. So type 2 diabetes mellitus is a major public health problem worldwide, affecting 425 million people in 2017, and it keeps on increasing, in which that estimated projection of 629 million cases by 245 in the year of 2045. So this is actually caused by the modifiable risk factors such as the dietary factors, the physical activity factors, and also lifestyle factors, which is modifiable risk factors. So according to the 2018 Global Burden of Disease, almost 35% of disability adjusted life years of diabetes are attributable to dietary factors, such as high intakes of sugar, meat, low intakes of vegetable, fruits, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and also yogurt. So when we are talking about dietary factors, what would you know about ultra processed food? So first, we would like to know what the definition of the ultra processed food itself. So ultra processed food, or the short form is the UPF. It is actually the foods which undergoes multiple physical, biological, and also chemical processes, and which mostly exclusive of industrial use. So the highlight here is the industrial use, and usually ultra processed food will contain food and also cosmetic additive as well as preservatives. So that is how we can differentiate between ultra processed food and also the usual or the natural food. And usually ultra processed food are spread worldwide, and especially in Western diets, representing between 25 to 60% of the total daily energy intake. So it has been known that ultra processed food was associated with increased risk of cancer, mortality, depressive symptoms. We have inflammatory bowel syndrome and also cardiovascular disease. And also the same research group, which is this Nutrinet Sante group, they also had done other prospective studies in which that they have observed an association between the intake of ultra processed food together with the increased mortality risk, depression, frailty, dyslipidemia in children, also in the risk of overweight and also obesity population, and also in getting hypertension. But currently, there are no similar or large-scale prospective study that has been conducted regarding consumption of ultra-processed food and type 2 diabetes, and that is why this study has shown that it will fill this current gap. So in terms of the research question for this study, so the research question that the study proposed is consumption of ultra-processed food associated with risk of developing type 2 diabetes, which is pretty straightforward. So when you are looking at the critical appraisal checklist, so when we are appraising the research question, so did the study address a clearly focused issue? So I think it is quite straightforward, in which that it addressed sufficient research gap, in which that they also explain in their problem statement and also in their introduction part of the paper, where there is a current lack of large-scale prospective study regarding intake of ultra-processed food as well as type 2 diabetes. So to answer the research question, so this study has also proposed the research objective to assess the associations between the consumption of ultra-processed food and also risk of type 2 diabetes. Okay, so now we move on to the materials and method. So in terms of the study population and data collection, so this Nutrinet Sante study is actually an ongoing, and it is the first ever a large cohort study launched in 2009 in France, which it involved a large scale of participants, and the main objective is to actually focus on the complex link between nutrition and health status, scheduled for a 10-year follow-up. So in this study, adults aged 18 years and above are continuously recruited among the general population and followed using a dedicated web interface. So notice that in this study, their method of data collection is all in the electronic base, which is the dedicated web interface for the study itself. And although that it is actually an electronic based study, but this study also needs to go through an extensive ethical review, in which that this study also has been approved by their relevant institutional review boards in France. So this is how the data collections techniques that was being used in the study. So first, you can see that interested participants are required to fill up the registration form, and also they are also required to sign an electronic consent form on the website itself. So once they have registered and once they have signed the consent form, they would receive an email containing the individual identification number and also password. So these participants who have already received their individual ID and also password, they need to access to the portal within 21 days. So when they have accessed the portal, they need to fill up all the necessary baseline information. Let's say that they did not do anything after 21 days, so they have to re-register again and they have to sign the consent form again. So this is how they actually get their participants, and also they give their consent form. Okay. So what are the types of questionnaires that the participants need to answer? So as you can see here, there are several sections. First is the socio-demographic and also lifestyle characteristic, in which that the participants needs to fill up their baseline information in terms of their sex, date of birth, educational level, and also smoking status, and also basic anthropometry information such as weight and height, and also physical activities, in which that in this study they assess the physical activities using the 7 days International Physical Activity Questionnaire. So this is actually a validated questionnaire to actually assess the level of physical activity of any individual. So they are using a validated questionnaire to assess the physical activity, and also the participants also need to declare their health status, in which that they need to fill up major health events, and also what are the kind of medications, what are the kind of the treatments that they are receiving every year. And on top of that, they're also required to record their dietary intake, in which that in that dietary intake they have to fill up 24-hour dietary records for 3 days within 2 periods of 2 weeks, in which that, in other words, they have given random days within that 2 weeks for 3 days. So they have filled up that 3 days of dietary records, and that 3 days consisted of 2 weekdays and also 1 weekend days. So why would they have to allocate the dietary records in such manner is because different people have different dietary patterns of different days. It could be probably on weekends people would be eating more, or people would be eating out, compared with the weekdays where people will only have the normal usual diet to work. So that's why they would have these 3 days of dietary records. Okay, and also in addition, in terms of the biochemical specimens, such as fasting blood samples, were also collected for almost 20,000 participants. So this is also on a voluntary basis, in which that those who are volunteered to be to get their sample collected, they are being asked to attend to visit in one of the hospital centers dedicated for that study, in which that they would have their blood collected and also clinical examination at that centers. But that also is voluntary, which means that they can attend, or they can also not attend to this biological specimen session collection. Okay, so in terms of the recruitment of the cohort, or recruitment of the population itself, so when we are talking about recruitment of the population, so these are the hints that we have to look for. So first, was the cohort representative of a defined population, and was there something special about the cohort, and was everybody included who should have been included in that study? So as you can see on the inclusion criteria of this study itself, it stated that this study is actually being implemented in a general population targeting internet using adult volunteers aged 18 years or more. So for this study, because they are targeting those who uses the internet, okay, and then for those adults using the internet, so actually we can't really tell whether the population that they are going to recruit would be representative of their whole population until they get the final data. But then in terms of the starting, in terms of how they would want to collect, or how would they want to get that large proportion of numbers, there would be an appropriate way. Okay, so in terms of this recruitment part, do you have any sharing that you would like to share? Do you have any opinions or any ideas on, in terms of, would there be any selection bias if we were to conduct a similar study? Any opinion? Okay, so if there is no opinion first, then I'll just proceed first. Okay, so when it comes to the dietary data, so the dietary data part is the most important part in this study, because because it is actually the exposure, because the outcome is the type 2 diabetes, right? So the exposure is the dietary data. So how would the researcher wants to comprehensively assess the dietary data of the participants? So first, as I have mentioned previously, participants were invited to complete a series of 3 non-consecutive validated web-based 24-hour dietary records, which means that the participants needs to recall their 24 hours diet, what they eat in one day for 3 days, but that 3 days is non-consecutive at every 6 months. Yeah? And then these 3 days would be randomly assigned over a 2 week period, which comprises of 2 weekdays and also 1 weekend day. And the NutriNet Sante Web self-administered 24-hour diet records also have been tested and validated against an interview by a trained dietitian, also against by blood and also urinary biomarkers. So it is not just a simply dietary records that they just upload on the website. They have made sure that the records or the system has been used, have been tested, and also have been validated before they use it in their study, which I think is a very good conduct, in which that no matter what type of tools or no matter what type of methods that we are going to use in our study, we have to make sure that it is properly tested and it is properly validated to be used in our study. Okay, so this is how the dietary records would look like. I don't really have the interface of the dietary records. This is just what being explained in the paper. So you can just imagine like it is a secured, user-friendly interface with detailed instruction. In fact, that they have detailed instruction in the form of booklets, in the form of videos, in the form of detailed instruction, so that the participant would know how to exactly enter their food intake in the dietary records. And then in terms of how they would fill up the dietary records is based on meal-based approach, in which that they have to fill up the time and also the quantity. Let's say for breakfast, how much they are taking, what they are taking. So it is based on the meal time based approach. And then in terms of the records, they are using the food browser containing food categories. So let's say they are taking cereals. So there are a food category under cereals. It is under bread, or is it pasta? So it is under food category. Or the participants can also search the type of foods that they are taking, or they can also manual type the type of foods they are taking in the system as well. So how do the participant actually estimate the portion size? Because portion size is also important to ensure that it is not underestimated and it is not overestimated. So we have to ensure that the portion size is correct for all participants. So this group of researchers actually use a validated photo booklet. So this validated photo booklet is uploaded onto the website so that the participants can visualize how much foods that they are taking, or if they know exactly the quantities, so they can also directly enter the quantities in the system itself. And then lastly, after the participants have entered all the necessary information on the dietary intakes, they have to declare whether the reported items were representative of the normal diet. Let's say that on that week that they have to record the dietary records, they are sick, or they have some kind of a problem, so they are losing appetite. So that would not be representative of their normal diet. So that's why they have to declare whether whatever that they're taking on that particular day or on that particular week is representative of their normal intake. Okay, and then all those nutrients intake, the corresponding nutrient intake, were then calculated using the NutriNet Sante food composition database containing more than 3,500 food items. So this database containing all the nutrient information such as the calories information, the carbohydrates, the fats, and so on. So that's why they have tabulated, or they have constructed their own food composition database. And then all these food and beverages were then further categorized into the ultra-processed food categories, because as this study aims to go investigate the effects of ultra-processed food, so they have to extract the data on that ultra-processed food specifically. So there are actually 4 NOVA categories. At first is the unprocessed, minimally processed food. Second, we have the culinary ingredients, and then we have processed food, and lastly is the ultra-processed food. And then this study primarily focused on the ultra-processed food NOVA group. So this study only focused on this NOVA group and to see the association with the type 2 diabetes risk. Okay, so how do they actually categorize these many types of foods, many types of beverages into the ultra-processed food categories? So all food and beverages items of the NutriNet Sante composition table were categorized by a team of 3 trained dietitians into one of the food groups into the NOVA. And then when they have classified all these type of foods, then the whole classification was then reviewed by a committee composed of 3 dietitians and also 5 researchers, and also specialists in the nutrition epidemiology, to ensure that the correct food belongs to the correct ultra-processed food category. So in case that there is any uncertainty for any given food or beverage item, a consensus was reached among researchers based on the percentage of homemade and also artisanal food versus industrial brands reported by the participant, in which that they would sit together and they would discuss the probability or the possibility of that food item to be placed under which categories. So based on the NOVA classification, so this is the classification of the ultra food category. So first is the group 1. So group 1 is the unprocessed or minimally processed food. So we have fruits like our normal fresh fruits. We have vegetables, eggs, milk, and meat. And then in group 2, we have the processed culinary ingredients. So this one is mainly focused on the culinary ingredients such as the salt, vegetables, oils, butter, and also sugar. And then group 3 is we have the processed food, but then these are the foods obtained by combining foods from group 1 and also group 2 to use in domestic, or also to be used in food products. That we have the sugar coated dry fruits, we have breads, we have jams. But then in this study, they are focusing or they are considering the foods that falls under the category of group 4, in which that the keyword here is the industrial processes, in which that these are the foods that have undergone hydrogenation, hydrolysis, extruding, molding, reshaping, pre-processing. And these kind of foods also normally contains flavoring agents, colors, emulsifiers, humectants, non-sugar sweeteners, and also cosmetic additive, which are also often added to these food products. So let's see what are the kind of examples of these food products. So these are all the examples of the ultra processed food group for their population or from their food database. So in terms of the beverages, we can see here they have all these sugary drinks, energy drink, flavored water, even the artificial sweetened beverage like diet sodas also considered as ultra processed food. And then they have the dairy products like flavored or artificially sweetened yogurt. Okay, and then all these cream cheese, milkshakes, dairy beverages, all these with texturizer, with emulsifier, with other colorant, with added flavors are also considered as ultra processed food. And then in terms of fat and sauces, like salad dressings, we have mayonnaise, ketchup, and also other dressing with flavor enhancers and also with additive are also considered as ultra processed food. And then under the groups of fruit and vegetables, there are also ultra processed food, in which that in terms of the instant powder or instant fruits and vegetables like canned vegetables, and then also like vegan products, like they have fruits and meatless nuggets or meatless sausages, meatless meat product, meatless burgers, which is also considered as ultra processed food. And then this one is more familiar, in which that we also know that those with chicken nuggets, fish fingers, and also all these um, protein imitation based product is also considered as ultra processed food. And then we have the starchy food and cereals under the breakfast cereals, if it is added with emulsifiers, added with colorants, if it is added with preservative, and same also goes with sugary products and also salty snacks. Okay, so that is on how they do actually extract that data on ultra processed food. Now, when this group of researchers want to identify the type 2 diabetes case in their study, so this is what we call as case ascertainment, which is the case identification. So in this study, participants were asked to declare their major health event and also current taken medication. And yes, Ron?
So this case ascertainment will be the next sections, how the study define the outcomes variable. Yeah, so before that, probably, is there any questions on how the ultra processed food or food categories are being categorized or classified? But one point I want to add is that remember the 24-hour dietary recall in the study, they actually asked the participants to record that over 2 weeks, 3 days, 2 weekdays and 1 weekend over 2 weeks. And that has to be repeated every 6 Monday for 2 years. And then the committee of the dietitians, the specialist researcher, all that, and they sit in, they take an average of every individual, of every food category, and from there they derive the exposure of the foods, ultra processed food, and as well as I think probably in the further slide you will be able to see the quality of the diet. They use another measures to measure the quality of diets beside the ultra processed food. Am I right, Iman? Yeah.
Yes, correct, Prof.
So you want to be very clear as the main exposure here about the food, how the food categories being classified and defined. Before we are moving now to how they define incidence of type 2 diabetes. Is there any comments or opinions so far? Okay, if it's not, then maybe you can still bring out any issues for discussions. Yeah, Iman, you may want to proceed.
Okay, thank you, Prof. So this is in terms of measuring the outcome, which is the type 2 diabetes itself. So in this study, participants were asked to declare their major health events and also current medication and treatments through the yearly health questionnaire, in which that they have to declare their health status every year. And this is also done through that specific interface on the study website. And besides that, the researcher actually counter-checked the data, the self-reported data from the participants linked to the general medical administrative database of the health insurance in France itself, in which that in that system, it provides detailed information about the reimbursement of medication and also medical consultation. Let's say that there are patients or there are participants who actually not reported that they are having type 2 diabetes. So this researcher can actually obtain that data from that database, from that administrative database. And besides that, mortality cases were also identified using a linkage to a French national mortality registry to actually capture participants who actually died during the study period. Okay, so this is one of the checklists when we are criticizing or when we are appraising a research paper, in which that one of the question is, was the exposure accurately measured to minimize bias? So in this study, so it is yes, because the exposure in this study is ultra processed food, and they are using the comprehensive method to actually measure the intake of UPF itself, in which that the method or the tools that they are using in this study was a validated web-based the 24-hour dietary records. And also the classification of the UPF itself was also reviewed by the expert committees to ensure that there was no misclassification of the food items. So this has been done comprehensively in this study. And then in terms of the outcome measure, which is the type 2 diabetes, so the incidence of type 2 diabetes and the data of the patient's eventual disease and also cause of death was also obtained from the participants' own health records or self-reported health records. And also they also cross-check or they also counter-check the information from the French and also from the database of the National Mortality Database. So this also accurately measured to actually minimize bias. Let's say that the participants, let's say that the researchers did not really use that counter check with the database system. So their participants could be underreported. So they could be underreported or they could be overreported. So there could be some kinds of bias there. So that's how they actually measured or minimize the bias, in which that they cross-check the data with the national database data. So, and in terms of the statistical analysis plan that is used in this study, so it is based on objectives. So the first specific objective for this study is to determine the proportion or the percentage of the UPF consumed. So this is pretty straightforward, in which that the researcher calculate the proportion of the ultra-processed food consumed in ratio with the total weight of the total food and also beverages consumed. So they are calculated this ratio or this proportion in terms of grams. And then to determine the proportion in weight of the UPF across the participants group. So this one is where they have compared the intake of UPF across different characteristics of participants. So this one, they are using the unpacked two-tailed t-test, and also the ANOVA to assess the differences between groups. And then on the third objective, where they would determine the association between the proportion of UPF and also the nutritional factors, they are using the regression analysis, and they adjusted their data for sex, age, and also total energy intake. And for the last objective is actually to evaluate the association between the proportion of ultra-processed food in the diet and also the incidence of type 2 diabetes. And this is where they are using this survival analysis, which is called as a cost-specific COX model, in which that they are using age as time scale, which means that they are using age as their covariates. Okay, so no matter whether the participants entered the study at age 40 or at age 18 or at age 60, they would adjust the starting age as their covariates. And for the purpose of analysis, the type 2 diabetes and death during follow-ups were handled as competing events, which is the events that would occur that is not based on the outcome of interest. And then participants also contributed person time, which is the duration of participation in that study until the date of type 2 diabetes, or until death, or until the date of last completed questionnaire, or January 9, 2019, whichever occurred first. So whichever occurred first is considered as the person time. And lastly, this study also considered another model to actually analyze survival analysis, which is called as the fine and gray. So fine and gray is also another model to calculate survival risk, but then at the end, they still selected the cost-specific COG model over these fine and gray models to analyze this association. Okay, so this is how they would adjust their cost-specific COGS model. So there are 5 adjustments of these models, in which that from the first models, they would adjust in terms of age, all the basic and also all the socio-demographic information such as age, sex, educational level, BMI, the physical activity, smoking status, alcohol intake, even the number of 24-hour dietary records also they adjusted, because let's say that I participated in that study, but I only contributed 3 dietary records. And then participant B contributed 6 dietary records. So they want to make it constant. So they would adjust the number of the dietary record as well. And then energy intake without alcohol, family history of diabetes, overall nutritional quality in the diet. So this is what Prof. Chu has mentioned, in which that on top of the ultra-processed food intake itself, they have this what we call as FSAM NPS dietary index, in which that they want to see the diet quality of the food, of the dietary intake itself. So they also calculated this score as well, in which that the highest score will indicate that the person would have lower or poorer nutritional quality. But then in this study, they adjusted in this model, they adjusted this index, or they adjusted this score to ensure that no matter whether one has a good or poor nutritional quality, that it does not affect this COX model. And then for models 2, they add on another nutrients intake, in which that we are going to see in details later in the results section. And also model 3, they also add on another covariates. Same also for model 4 and also model 5. In model 5, they adjust for weight change during follow-up. So all tests were two-sided, and p less than 0.05 were considered as statistically significant. So in this study, they are using the HSAAS statistical software to analyze their data.
Yeah, maybe we can pause for a while. Is there any questions on the statistical tests? Maybe one questions may appear is that why are they applying so many modeling in one study? So one immediate reason is that in modeling, there's one bias that can happen if the modeling is over adjusted. So in their statistical methods, I think they want to avoid over adjustment, so they do like step by step, by block, because I think they have sufficient sample size. If they want to do, just go ahead with the model 5, adjusting for all the possible covariates. That could confound the incidence of type 2 diabetes. I think to be more cautious, I think they have done what they have done is that they try to adjust. Model 1 is the basic, most important fundamental covariates, according to the researcher. and then they move on to add one, and then add further covariates, all that. And if you really want to be very picky and to be very strict, then you should go for a modified. Yeah, but be always careful if you over adjust for your exposure. So there's a risk of over adjustment, and then the effects is underestimated or overestimated. There's a bit the risk, but there's no risk of insufficient sample size. Yeah, if you are a researcher or if you are very keen about type 2 diabetes incidence, looking at all these models and covariates, do you think they have included sufficient or enough covariates? Is there any factor do you think is important but they did not include? Any suggestion, comment? Is there any psychologists here or psychiatrists? Personally, I think they could have considered emotional health, something like depressions or psychiatric diseases or distress as one of the covariate. Yeah, I mean, of course, we can argue and discuss why they omitted that one, or why is it necessary to consider emotional disorder as one of the possible covariate in this study, which I think they did not include that. Any
Prof,
comments?
I think my personal opinion is one of the covariates that we would also need to consider. I'm not sure about their culture. Probably is their supplements intake. Because I noticed that in model 4 they actually adjusted for their medications in terms of the dyslipidemia and also hypertension. Probably other type of medications.
So provided if you believe certain supplements could be, has an effect on the incidence of type 2 diabetes. Some supplement is protective or could actually cause type 2 diabetes and confound the effect of ultra processed food. Yeah, then you want to adjust for that as well. And I hope you still you know what is the definition for confounding factors. And this study so far, if you have understood and followed, is a causal study, and specifically is an etiological study trying to determine the effect of ultra processed food on causing type 2 diabetes. So they have to be very strict on measuring all the possible covariates, and then they can conclude independent effect of ultra processed food on the incidence of type 2 diabetes. Yeah, so anyone who has additional opinion or areas of expertise, you will actually be able to identify whether their models has been sufficient, in adjusting for other important factors, causal factors of type 2 diabetes. And if you did have a good reason that they have not included that factor, then you're likely to be right. And when you interpret the result, then you want to be careful that the model has not account for that factor. Yeah, okay.
Okay, so this is what Prof. Chu has mentioned, in which that in terms of appraising statistical analysis plan, one of the important factors is actually to consider the confounding factors. So whether the authors have identified all important or all possible confounding factors that can actually affect the outcomes of interest. So in this study, in terms of the regression models, they have actually included the important confounders such as the sex, age, and also total energy intake, which is included in the regression models. And in terms of the Cox regression models to analyze in terms of the survival analysis, so they also have included, they even have 5 different block models of different confounding factors included in the Cox regression models.
Okay, so you may find that the judgment here is really you have to judge, yeah. So I mean, according to Iman, then is actually quite good. It's quite many factors has been adjusted for. But to me, probably I would say no. If I think emotional distress, emotional factors has not been adjusted for, yeah, then you it's actually you then need to keep that in mind when you come to read the result and whether you want to apply the result. Yeah, okay.
Okay, and then in terms of the follow-up, so in this study, because it is a long study, which is 10 years of follow-up, so I think it is sufficient enough to actually see the outcomes of interest. Okay, so any questions on the statistical analysis before we proceed with the results? Okay, so if there is no question, then I'll just proceed. So this is the flow chart on the selection of the study population. So as you can see, initially around almost 130,000 of participants included in January 2017 with more than 2 dietary records. But then 21 and 56,000 of the participants would need to be excluded from the study, from the analysis because of the energy underreporters. So underreporters means that the individual does not report what they are actually taking in, what they are actually eating. So that's why we have to exclude those energy underreporters, because we don't want their underreporting of results could affect our outcomes of interest. And then because of this exclusion, 980,000 participants with valid dietary data included in the study, but then these are all the amounts of participants who had to be excluded because they have prevalent incident of type 1 diabetes, or they already had type 2 diabetes, and also they have a null follow-up. And lastly, they have this final number of 104,707 participants included in the final study population. So among the participants, almost 80% were women and 20% were men. And the mean age of the participant was 42.7 years. So going back to our objective, for objective number 1 is to determine the proportion or the percentage of the ultra-processed food consumed. So the main weight contribution of the ultra-processed food to the diet was around 17.3%. So it's almost 20%. And then most of the ultra-processed food was found in the sugary food intake, which is around almost 30%. Followed by the processed food and also vegetables, beverages, which is the sweetened beverages. Okay, and then breakfast cereals, and also lastly is the processed meat and fish. So these are the components of ultra-processed food found in the participants' diet records. And then going to objective number 2, which is to determine the proportion in weight of ultra-processed food consumed across participants groups. So this on the left is the characteristic of the participants. This is the number of the participants participated in the study. And this is the proportion of the ultra-processed food in the diet. So as you can see here, if we are comparing age as the characteristic, those who are aged between 18 to 44 years old, which is the younger group of participants in this study, actually contributed around 20% of the ultra processed food, and this is highest among the 3 groups. Okay, and then if you look at the gender, okay, so men also contributed more ultra-processed food compared than women, although that there are more women than men in the study, because men is only 20%. But then if you look at the mean numbers here, it is not much very different. It's only the difference is only around 0.3. But then because of the sample size is large, then that's why the p-value is significant here. But then the mean difference here is not very large difference. In terms of educational level, the intermediate educational levels also showed high ultra-processed food intake, but then if you are looking in terms of the mean values, it's also not a very big difference. In terms of smoking status, those who are current smokers are also contributed to the high intake of ultra-processed food. And those with low physical activity level, as computed through the IPAC questionnaire, also contributed to the higher number of intake of ultra-processed food. And lastly, in terms of body mass index, okay, those with BMI more than 30 also contributed a higher number of ultra processed food in the diet compared to the other BMI categories. So in terms of interpreting this proportion of weight and also the characteristic of the participants, because of this group of participants, they have large numbers of participants. So other than the significant values here, we also need to look at the mean values here, whether it is a large enough values or not. Okay. And then moving on to the third objective, which is to determine the association between the proportion of UPF and also the nutritional factor. So this objective is carried out using the linear regression, multiple linear regression. So as you can see here, so these are all the significant significant association of the proportion of the ultra processed food with the nutritional factor. So first we look at this dietary index. So as I have mentioned before, the higher the dietary index, the poorer the quality of the diet. So as you can see here, so this is positively associated, in which that means the higher the proportion of ultra processed food in the diet, the higher the dietary index, which means the poorer the quality of the diet itself. And then in terms of the energy intake, it's also positively associated, in which the higher proportion of ultra processed food in the diet, the higher their energy intake. And then in terms of the alcohol intake, is negatively associated, but then this was not being discussed anywhere in the discussion section. I was also looking for this justification or for the discussion. So if you would like to share any opinions on the direction of this, you can actually share your opinion. Okay, and then in terms of the sodium intake is also positively associated, because most of the ultra processed food also contains high sodium. Okay, similar to saturated fatty acid, sugar, okay, sugary drinks, and also red and processed meat. So inversely, those fibers, whole grains, yogurts, this is when we are talking about the natural yogurts, okay, and then nuts and also fruits and vegetables were negatively associated with the proportion of ultra processed food in the diet. Okay, any opinion on this?
Maybe the one that you can interpret from this table is that the bad one go together, isn't it?
Yes, yes,
Huh?
correct.
And the same sort of
Only this alcohol is inversely associated with the ultra processed food, in which that I also had not found any justification on that matters. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So in terms of the last objective, which is to evaluate the association between the proportion of UPF and also the incidence of type 2 diabetes. So during the follow-up, which is the person years, the median follow-up is around 6 years. There are 821 incident of type 2 diabetes cases were detected, and the absolute incident rates for type 2 diabetes in the whole population were 132 per 1,000 person years. Or in other words, we could translate this as, if we follow up 100,000 people in 1 year, there would be 132 cases of type 2 diabetes will be detected. And when these data are corrected for sex age, the absolute rate will actually increasing according to the quartile of the UPF consumption, in which that the higher the consumption of the UPF in the diet, the higher would be the absolute rates of the type 2 diabetes incidence. As we can see here, compared with the first quarter, is only 113 incidents of type 2 diabetes per 100 person years. When we compare with the fourth quarter, which is the highest consumption of ultra processed food in the diet, there would be 166 cases, incidents of type 2 diabetes. Okay, so this is just some explanation on the person time. Okay, so person time is actually the estimate of actual time at risk, in which that what are the duration that the participant contributed to the study. Because why do we have to know about this person time? Because this person time can actually be used to calculate the rate of the health outcome, or we call it as the incidence rate, like how they would get this 821 incident based on the person time. Okay, and this is how incident rate is being calculated. It is calculated based on the formula of new cases divided by the denominator of population time with the time frame. Okay, so this is the results of the Cox regression analysis. So association between the proportion of UPF and also the risk of type 2 diabetes from all models were actually significantly associated. Okay, as you can see here in the model 1, where we use all these baseline necessary information, it is associated with the type 2 diabetes risk with the 15% of hazard risk. Okay, and then in model 2 also, when they unadjusted for the dietary index score, but then they adjusted for the nutrient intake such as the saturated fatty acid, sodium intake, sugar intake, and dietary fiber intake, it is also significantly associated with the type 2 diabetes risk. And same also goes with model 3, model 4, and also model 5. So in other words, we can see that no matter what are the covariates that we are putting in the model, the UPF alone, which is the ultra processed food alone, can actually be associated. This is not causal, but it is also it is associated with the type 2 diabetes itself. Am I right, Prof. Chiu?
Can you repeat again?
Okay, so in terms of the models itself, so because we have so many covariates, right? So no matter what covariates that we are putting in the models, it can be concluded that the ultra processed food itself can be associated with the risk of type 2 diabetes.
Yeah, you're right. So it depends on which model that you want to choose to apply the result to your life lah. Remember, the model has different covariates, and the strictest of all is a model 5. But remember, it could be over adjustment. Then you have underestimated the effect of ultra processed food lah. Yeah, but usually people want to go for the strictest model, like model 5. Yeah. So by all of this, they have shown, you look at the 95% confidence interval, so the independent effect of ultra processed food on the incidence of type 2 diabetes is kind of proven to have a significant effect on that lah. So if the more ultra processed food we take, the higher risk of us developing type 2 diabetes between a follow-up period of 5 years, right? In this study, between 8 to 8 million follow-up period of 5 years, a range of 3 to 8 years. Yeah, so the risk here you can see, if you're going for the strictest model like model 5, so we have a 13% higher risk. 13%, what does it mean is that 100 people, 13 people will get it lah, in a follow-up period of 5 years. Yeah, so let's say in Faculty of Medicine UPM, we have like 300 people, right? So there'll be about what, 35 people will get it in 5 years. If we take ultra processed food, despite of weight change, holding constant of all the comorbidity, holding constant of the quality of diet, holding constant of family history, holding constant of your sex, age, education level, BMI, physical activity, smoking status, alcohol intake. So that's what it means. Yeah, very terrifying.
Okay, does anyone have any opinions or sharing on this? Any thoughts on this? Okay, so in overall, so remember about the competing events. So there were 340 competing events of death detected during the course of the study. Okay, so when we are interpreting the results of the study, so these are some of the hints or some of the clues that we could actually use when we are appraising a research article. So in this study, when we are looking at the most basic model, which is a model 1, there would be a 10-point increment in the percentage of ultra-processed food in the diet will increase 15% risk of type 2 diabetes. And even when there are many adjustments for many covariates, like Prof. Chu has mentioned, it also remains significant, in which that the intake of ultra-processed food alone itself can actually increase the risk of getting type 2 diabetes despite all the covariates. holding all these the age, the gender, even your body weight, even the changes of body weight, even we hold all this covariate constant, it can also lead to significant association of intake of ultra processed food with the increased risk of type 2 diabetes. And in terms of interpreting whether the results are precise or not, so because this study has large sample size of, so the confident interval would be narrow lah. Okay, so I think in terms of the sample size would not be much issue lah in terms of these studies. Okay, so do you believe the results? So this is actually in terms of your own judgment and in terms of your own interpretation on the results of the research articles when you are appraising a research article. So in this study, so the result can be accepted considering it has large sample size as well as the inclusion of potential confounders in the model. But then as Prof. Cho has mentioned, there could be other confounders as well, like mental health status, emotional health status that can also be considered as the confounding factors as well.
Maybe you can pause for a while and see any opinion from the participants. You have been followed the appraisal so far. Do you believe the result? Or maybe first of all, do you understand the result? Then would you believe it? If you still remember the types of ultra processed food, when I read that samples of ultra processed food is also horrifying to me that I've been picking them, especially during party, all that, right? So if you remember that chocolate, all that kind of yogurt, we thought, and the vegans, the fake prawn, fake all the drumstick, all that kind of thing, are being classified as ultra processed food. And the last, I think the slide the Iman was showing, the 10 point there is actually a 10% addition. I mean, in terms of all the food that we are taking, just 10% of it, are to be ultra processed food. So we have a 15% higher risk of getting type 2 diabetes in a median follow-up of 5 years. So I'm wondering what's the rate in the general population in Malaysia. And this is an increment additional to that. So all of us have some background risks, and this is an addition to the background risks if we take more ultra processed food. Yeah. So probably as we discussed about this paper earlier on, I think we probably want to ring an alarm to our friends who are taking a vegetarian diet. If they are taking so many fake ones instead of the natural vegetables or that, it does not seem to be more healthy than they thought. Any comments? Anyone? It's not, then I think we'll proceed.
Okay, so when we are interpreting the results, one of the most important consideration is also to consider whether the results can be applied to the local population. So the results can actually guide to conduct a similar research in our local population, but then it cannot be entirely be applied to our population because we have, of course, we have the differences in terms of the background of the participants, especially we have different dietary norms, we have different dietary practices and also dietary patterns, but then this could be some kind of a stepping stone or some kind of a guide to conduct a similar research. And in terms of do the results of the study fit with other available evidence? So it is not really, because it is an observational study, so it cannot be a causal study. And also, I think many studies are also ongoing in terms of finding a factors or finding a causal for the diabetes itself. Not saying that only ultra processed food can lead or can be associated with diabetes. Okay, and then we proceed with the discussion. So in terms of the nutritional quality in this large cohort, UPF consumption was associated with increased type 2 diabetes risk because as we all know, usually ultra processed food have lower nutritional quality because they are of higher sodium, higher energy, higher fat, higher sugar, and poorer in fiber and also exhibit a higher glycemic index value. And even in a previous study in which that they seen in a 1 month randomized clinical trial, the ultra processed food actually led to an increased energy intake, which was then highly correlated with weight gain, which weight gain was also associated with type 2 diabetes risk. But then if you can recall in our model 5, where the researcher adjusted the weight change, so this could not actually entirely explain the association observed, because their models were also adjusted for BMI and weight change, in which that regardless of whether there are higher BMI or regardless of whether the participants take increased energy intake or higher energy intake and cause them to gain weight, but then the ultra processed food itself also can directly associate it with increased type 2 diabetes risk. And other than that, ultra processed food also usually contains trans fats that will link to increased risk of heart disease and also type 2 diabetes. Then one of the most important component when we are talking about ultra processed food is the food additives. So the use of additive might also contribute to the development of diabetes, because there are some previous studies, I think, but this is, I think, is just lab studies in which that they have found that food additive can actually impact glucose intolerance, increase insulin resistance, and also inhibit insulin signaling in human cells. And as for most additive, human data on long-term health effects is also still lacking. And there are also maybe a potential endocrine disruptors of this food additive, but it is also remain largely unknown. Then in terms of the contact materials, ultra-processed food often stay in their packaging for a long periods owing to extended expiration date, because one of the most important differences between ultra-processed food and the usual processed food is actually their shelf life. Usually ultra-processed food would have longer shelf life. So they would stay in their packaging for a long periods, and this would increase the exposure to chemicals used in industrial plastic packaging, such as phthalates and also what we call as bisphenol S. And this also has been shown to have some endocrine disrupting properties. And the authors also suggested that there would also be some kind of contaminants during processing, in which that high temperature heating and also processing may also produce contaminant we call as neoform contaminants in UPF. And these acrylamide and also acrolein metabolites were associated with insulin-resistant urinary biomarkers of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which then positively associated with diabetes. And this high level of urines, or what we call as contaminants, were also observed in industrial breakfast cereals, canned food, and also coffee that raise concern because it has its hepatotoxic and also genotoxic properties. So what we can conclude is actually UPF is not only about their nutritional quality, okay, or their nutritional content, or their nutrients content, or their nutritional values, but also other external factors as well, such as the processing itself as well, such as the contaminants, such as the additive as well. Then going on to the limitation of the study. So if you can still remember on how the study get or identify the case or the diabetes case in the study. So they have used the self-reported, and also they also cross-check with the national or their database of the national database. But then the exhaustiveness could not also be guaranteed, because there are almost 20% of type 2 diabetes cases are estimated to be underdiagnosed in the France. So they may be participants who already had diabetes, but they don't know because it is underdiagnosed. And then because this is an observational study, so causation could not be established, and residual confounding cannot be entirely ruled from one single study, because they only have one group of population of participants. However, the results remain unchanged because they actually have this sensitivity analysis. They adjust for many lifestyle and also dietary confounders. Let's say we have, because they recruited those adults aged more than 18, right? So they have put age as their covariate. So no matter what age the participants entered the studies, it had the participants has made that covariates as constant. Okay, and then in terms of the ultra processed food categories, although that it covers diverse food products, but it was not designed to focus on a specific food category or to isolate a particular process or a particular additives. So we only, the researcher only categorized the food category based on the ultra processed food categories, not not based on a particular process or not based on what kind of additive or what kind of preservative that they contain. And then lastly, the limitation of the study would be that the participants of this study were younger, okay, because more than half of the participants were less than 44 years old, more often women, which is almost 80% were women, with higher educational level and healthier dietary habits. So this could lead to underestimation of the associations owing to a narrower range of UPF intake. Okay, so any other additional comments on the limitations of the study, or how can we, if we were to conduct similar study, or how can we actually improve this study? Any comments or any opinions or any suggestions?
Is there any more slide, Iman?
No, Prof. Ending already.
Okay. Right. So we have this piece of evidence from French. So first of all, I think you want to remember the research questions, the P, right? So the P here is the French. And then if you want to apply this into our life and living in Malaysia, then you have to consider the many cultural differences. Yeah. So I mean the first important would be the food culture or the food habits or dietary practices between the two different country. Yeah. And then having said that, the main exposure being ultra processed food, and the scientific generalization is actually not decided by culture. If you remember and believe ultra processed food, how ultra processed food enter the body, and how the French body or Malaysian body or Indian or Chinese Malay body handle ultra processed food and the ingredients or components of ultra processed food, if you believe scientifically these are similar, then to some extent you can actually believe the piece of evidence presented here in this paper to be applicable in our life. Yeah. So these are quite straightforward and easy to appreciate. The more difficult and challenging one is that how you apply the effect sizes. Just how we did discuss a bit, how much increased risk of consuming ultra processed food, and how much of that would make our risks of getting type 2 diabetes increases in the coming 5 years or 3 to 8 years. So that risk, that effect size will be up to careful interpretations and applications lah. Yeah. So if you take epidemiological approach as what are presented in this study to be believable, to be credible, so I think the risk effect size is going to be more or less the same in terms of taking ultra processed food and also the incidence of type 2 diabetes. So around, right, say 12-13% of if we are taking higher proportion of ultra processed food, the one thing that's not so clear in the paper is that the categorization of the ultra processed food. In some part they said 0.1 point increment, and then in another part they say about 10-point increment. So we were actually also kind of confused why they categorize ultra processed food proportions into 10 points. So how does that? How did they do that? It wasn't actually clearly explained. Did they actually divide the percentage or the proportion in weight of ultra processed food, divided it by 10, so they get 10 points. Yeah, for every 1 point is actually equivalent to 10 points. So that 10 point is 10% by our deduction. You can get more of this information in their supplement. Yeah, so do not skip through any paper without looking into their supplement. Yeah, so by taking that, understanding that as 10 point, as 10%, that means you still remember the calculation that is actually 10% of all the food that we take. If that dietary intake was average from 3 days over 2 years. Yeah, so 10% is actually not much, you know. So if I'm looking at an average myself, I think I'm taking almost that amount, or even more than that. If you know celebrate your Sunday weekend every week, I think easily my proportion is more than 10%. So my risk, you know, hopefully the modern one has included family history, right? I think 1 in 3 or 1 in 2 of us, all of us have family history. So hopefully taken into account the background risk, I think hopefully the risk is, you know, below 20%, around 15%. If you are taking ultra processed food, if you can't avoid it, if that's an enjoyment of life, yeah, if you can't live a happy life without ultra processed food, I mean, then you have to take the risk of this increment risk. And is there any way we can reduce this? If you look at the model, they have included physical activity. So despite of whatever level of physical activity you are having, if you take ultra processed food, that increment in the risk is still there. You know? That's what it says. You know? Yeah, that's why I'm saying it's quite horrifying. Ultra processed food is good. I mean, it's something that's nice to take, but every time you take it in a higher proportion, it increase the risk of type 2 diabetes. Yeah. Any comments? Anyone to refute or want to say anything? Otherwise we shall end in 3 minutes.
In the meantime, I would like to share a slide on the QR code for MMA CPD points. Boleh, Prof?
Can.
Okay.
Any questions or any comments at all?
So this is the QR code for MMA CPD points, and then for your e-certificate and for UPM CPD points, you can fill up the Google form attached in the text box, in the chat box.
Any critiques on the paper, on the research itself? Would you imagine we have one similar one in Malaysia?
I think we can, Prof, but I think one of the issues that we can address or we can improvise is because this study, they actually included those who are interested in the study, so they can go on the website, right? But then what about those who lives outside the area or who don't have internet access? If we were to implement this study in Malaysia, how would we include all this population? Because we want to make our study more representative of our Malaysian population, right? That one is issues that we can address.
Yeah. I mean, we also did discuss. If you Google for this NutriNet Scientist study, there are actually many studies reporting related to this study, and one of the paper have actually verified that their samples wasn't representative of French populations. Yeah, and you can actually quite expected it to happen that way because they recruit patients through online interface, online form, all that, right? So only the most of the young people who are actually quite, you know, surfing the net and exposed to online, and then they are likely to be the participants who were actually exposed to the advertisement and they are likely to participate. And then if you are concerned about representativeness, then the next measures that you want to overcome that will be, you know, apply different technique in sampling, and whether you want to do that with additional cost and effort, while knowing that you can adjust for the the factors in the statistical methods. Okay, so I mentioned to you about representativeness has actually implied the generalizability of the study. So the study, the French, if you're a French nationals, then you want also to consider whether you want to believe your own national study, yeah, because you can argue the participants were not representative of the French national, right? But and knowing that the statistical method can adjust for all the factors, holding all the other constants, then the questions then appeared. How important it is in the study design. You want to achieve representativeness while knowing that you can adjust for all the factors in the statistical test. So our response would be statistical tests in all that different tests that you can use and apply. They are not actually perfect in adjusting for the factors. Remember statistical assumptions that you have to fulfill in every statistical test that you use. Yeah, so how much can be adjusted for if there's a discrepancy, if there's some defect in the study design, we are not very sure. We are not we cannot be very clear and give you a good response on that. But we hope we can find an answer. Yeah. But in anyone in the participants, if you have a good answer, explanation to that, I welcome you to speak up. Yeah. Or else we will not be able to tell whether this study designs and statistical methods to overcome the defect in study design, how good it is. But epidemiological principle would say it's not good enough. Yeah, we always want to achieve our study design the best, and then whatever that is not achievable in the study design or unpredictable things happen during the data collections, all that. So a statistical method will come to the rescue. But we know that it's not perfect. Yeah, it's not good enough. But in another way, it's actually may minimize defect in the study design. Okay, no comments. Had been very, very good audience. Okay, if there's no last comments or questions, we shall stop here. Is that okay? Iman, do you have any last comments?
No, Prof. Only to fill up the registration form on the chat box and also the attendance lah. And for this session, actually for our MGH session, we are uploading the recorded session on our YouTube channel. And also you can also read the commentaries on our newsletter later on, because from the previous one, we have published the commentaries on our previous newsletter.
When will be the next MGH?
The next MGH would be in, let me see.
19 November?
Yes, Prof.
Yeah, so the next MGH 3 will be on the same time on 19 November. Yeah, so look out for our poster. I think we will also announce the selected paper on the poster. Yeah. Right. So meanwhile, I think if you want to follow CRU's activities and post comments and opinions about our activity, please go to our Facebook. Yeah, go to our Facebook. You can look for the Facebook by the name of CRU _ HPPM, or to be just CRU HPPM. Okay, right. So can we stop here then? And thank you very much for the very good, being a good audience. And all the best to your weekend. And remember, don't take too much ultra processed food. Okay, bye.
Okay, thank you everyone. Bye.